one. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Mushiri Nyaga from Local Development Research Institute in Nairobi, Kenya. On behalf of the Data for Development Global Research Hub, D4D.net, welcome to today's State of Open Data Roundtables. Today we start with one on open data and national statistics. And these are part of an effort to refresh the State of Open Data report that was originally published in 2019. A lot has since happened, and our hope is that a refreshed chapter will help the community understand what has happened since and what the prospects could be going forward. Our chair for this session is Shaida Badiee, Managing Director of Open Data Watch, an NGO focused on monitoring and promoting open data in national statistics offices. She has been an active member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Group on the Data Revolution. She co-chairs the Sustainable Development Solutions Network at SDSN, and has played a key role with the startup of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. As a senior advisor, Shaida works closely with the Data 2X team, focused on knowledge creation and advocacy for closing gender data gaps. We call her Mama Data. I don't know if I've missed any accolades. Shaida, I'm sure there's a couple of pages somewhere that I've not mentioned. But welcome. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, dear Muchiri, and thanks for the invitation to be moderating this segment of the roundtables. And really was magnificent working with you in 2019 on that famous book on state of open data, and chapter 13. I don't know how I ended up taking chapter 13, but it was a lucky number for that book on focusing on official statistics. So we will, and really welcoming your efforts and the D4D.net efforts in trying to do a refresh of the work that we did in 2019, and really excited today with this roundtable, both with amazing panelists that we have that I will introduce soon, but also trying to get help, a lot of help from our audience. And we wanted our audience to really feel that this is roundtable and they are really engaged and involved, to sort of tell us a little bit more about themselves, where they are. And also, as we move through our discussions, we really want them to be engaged in some of the questions or some of the issues that we're trying to look at. The overall objective is to see where we are, do a stock taking, and open data has been an amazing community-based activity for us. As you will see, this panel and the people we have today represent that rich community, from producers, from the users, from watchdog organizations, from advocacy organizations, from donors, and from many aspects of the stakeholder partnership that we have around open data. And as the open data and the data revolution progresses, we see that this community is going to have a very important role to play in making the open data journey to add value to the work that we are doing. So to set the scene, before I introduce our amazing panelists, I just wanted to do a quick scene setting presentation, just to sort of see where we are. Many of you who have registered probably or listening, whether on the YouTube channel or D4D.net or on Zoom, you probably know a lot about open data and are interested and curious about it. But let me just quickly do a scene setting presentation. Then we'll come to you, the audience, with a question. And my colleague, Jay Said, from Program Manager at Open Data Watch, who is going to be helping us to sort of watch the space on the chat. So please, we're hoping that you would be very active on the chat. And then, of course, we'll come to our panelists for round 1 and round 2 of discussions. And between the round 1 and round 2, we come back to you, our audience, again for some questions. So without further ado, let me just pull up my slides and sort of see whether I can share that. I hope everybody can see this. And what I'm trying to focus on the state of open data for national statistics. And as we go through the presentation and also our discussions, we will probably try to sort of break that down as what is national statistics, and how can we get more value from this work, and how can we actually make this process much more efficient, how improve the quality, how to improve the data coverage, and how to make the link between data and policy much better. So there's a lot to unpack with this topic. But let me start with this, with data for development being really a critical to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is very, very important for us, as we have seen through the COVID and through the SDG implementation. And it's nicely said by the UN Secretary General that data has the power to save lives and to transform our world, but only if it's open, accessible to all, and it's actually used so that you can get the value out of data. And we are in this session really concerned much with the development data, but from the official statistics side. Let me just tell you a little bit about that. What this data is very important, and it actually includes very important data sets that decision makers really need. For example, decision makers that you've seen for COVID-19 management, and for SDG, and for other crises that we are facing. This data are collected through census, through surveys, and through administrative records. And these are the products of what we call National Statistical System, and which is really a confederation of official agencies that in most countries are coordinated by the National Statistical Office. And I'm really glad to have very, very informed and very important representatives from National Statistical Office at the national level, but also at the international level, to share with us their experience. So one important consensus, which I hope we hear more also from our panelists, is that for data to bring value, it needs to go through a number of steps, from production to dissemination to use and impact. And we call this really data value chain. And to realize the value of data, open data, as you see, is key, and is as what I call the linchpin of the data value chain. It's what brings the production and connects it to the use and impact. Production is mostly a cost to data production, whereas use is a value that we get out of the data production and data dissemination analysis. So for us, open data is really a connector of how do you bring cost into bringing value for societies and for our environment. Now, the other consensus that we see here is around what is the definition, and how do we define open data? And as you see here, many of you know, is open data is defined as for data that should be non-proprietary. It should be machine readable so that you can easily use it. Should be accessible, not a website that is closed 6 days a week, or it costs or charges. And it has to be open license so that, when people use it, is legally available. And as you see, a lot of this, and our experience shows, a lot of these elements of the open data are not expensive to implement, even though many countries or many important agencies are still behind in implementing all these principles of open data. They're not really that expensive to implement, but what is a very important factor for it is that we will need to have leadership. We will need to have, expertise, and we need to have political support for open data. Those are all this enabling environment that open data that our panelists today, I hope, will also talk to you about it. Now, I'm adding this slide because I really, I think this is a very important slide for us and for the audience and for the panels to give us feedback on moving forward. Why does open data for development really matters? And, we'll hear a lot of these comments under each one of these 5 categories that I have organized here. We will hear a lot from our panelists, but I think it doesn't need to be reminded that it really promotes economic growth and job creation. We've seen a lot of estimates that different groups have done to actually see what is the value, what is the return of investment from open data. The UK has done that, and the European Union has done that, and it's really proven that open data can really help with the economic growth. National statistical offices, by making the data more accessible, of course, they help businesses. They help other government agencies to have access to data. So there's many ways of gaining from promoting open data. Of course, the second thing we say here is improving efficiency and effectiveness of public services. We all, as users of public services, we see how open data has helped governments to become much more efficient and much more service-oriented and much more trusted in some ways. And of course, increasing transparency, accountability, and citizen participation. Again, I hope today we will hear from some of our panelists how this has really unfolded within the context that they're working or within the country that they're working. Fostering better information sharing within government. This I have seen at the organizational level work very well for organizations that are being very disjointed, and open data has really been able to bring the different groups together and around open data, but also government agencies, and and even hopes for public and private services to be able to be better connected through open data. And finally, last but really important point, again, some of our panelists I hope will talk about is encouraging evidence-based policymaking and monitoring. So this is really these 5 elements as where, is really at the heart of what I hope we would be talking about. But before I end, let me just quickly tell you about open data and how we've been in the past 20 plus years. It has evolved. It has not been a revolution. It has been a rather slow evolution, and I think it will become, part of lives going forward. That evolution will have to continue. The first thing I wanted to, a few of these boxes that I wanted to bring your attention. One of them, very important to me, and I know to many of you, is what was established by the UN Statistical Commission in '94, which was endorsed by all countries, was the fundamental principle of official statistics. There are 2 fundamental principles which are really important for open data. One of them is, of course, the first principle, which is the principle 1, which arguably actually incorporates the remaining 9 and embraces the core principle of open data that says that official statistics that meet the test of practical utility are to be compiled and made available on an impartial basis for official statistical agencies to honor citizens' entitlement to public information. Very well said as the first one. But the smart of the fundamental principle is that there is also a fundamental principle number 6, which also guards against privacy and individual data and managing the risk of certain micro data sets. So what we're talking about in open data is really both on promoting use and value of data, but also promoting safe and managing risk and privacy of citizens. So we're not talking about sort of sloppy, just put everything up open data. We're talking about data to be very well governed, very well managed. The other boxes you see is how open data has evolved in the past years. And the boxes that you see on the right is that there's been really important advancements through the UN Statistical Commission and through the through this normative side of the open data, of deciding what is open data by default, and countries endorsing it, and how how we can actually go about implementing it. Implementation is on the way, but there's a lot of work that's been done on setting norms and standards. So these are basically the bulk of my presentation. But before I end, I just wanted to quickly, if I may, to tell you a little bit about the status of where we are on open data for official statistics through looking through a lens of open data inventory that we use to actually keep track of the state of open data in official statistics. In this map, actually, you see what you see is the result of the open data inventory in 2020. And that includes about 187 countries. High scoring countries tend to be clustered, as you see, in North America, Europe, and Oceania. And then the highest scoring country, difficult to see, of course, on this map, it was Singapore, followed by Poland and Scandinavian countries. And a few countries could not be included because they do not maintain official websites for data. And this is one of the practices, one of the things that we want to change and incentivize countries to do better in managing their data portals. We wanted to also show you very quickly that there are some sectors like gender data are lagging behind other types of data. So not all data in terms of openness and availability are the same. So we need to look sometime under the hood of open data to sort of see where we're doing well. And this is again discussion today, and where we need to do better. Some of the areas like official statistics for economic and financial data are doing much better because they've been invested, areas that we have invested in for many years. But some areas like environment or gender, where there've been some chronicle underinvestment, we will see that they're not doing as well. Again, here, not all statistics are the same, and as you see that they're not on the same trajectory, and we need to worry about some of the things which are not improving as much as other sectors. I just wanted to end by saying that we're in the middle of a very big evaluation of Odin for 2022-2023. I can't wait to see improvements in many countries, but we're going through a very detailed review of where countries stand under data coverage and data openness, and hope to be announcing the result coming soon. So with that said, I just want to stop sharing here my slides, and then maybe come to introduce our panel, and also go to Jay right after I introduce the panel. Go to Jay to see whether there are any points that you want to raise from the audience before we move forward. So let me first introduce the panel, and Jay, I'll come to you in a second. We have 4 amazing people here from our community that have been part of this evolution of open data. Starting with Grant Cameron. Grant is the director of STSN Trends. Trends is a thematic group of the STSN that's focusing on data. We also have Luis Gerardo González Morales. Luis is the chief at the UN Statistics Division, is in charge of many things, including web development and data visualization, and many important functions for making UN data open and accessible. Then we have Akrom Sultanov, who's the head of the State Committee of the Republic of Uzbekistan on Statistics. And he also oversees open data and open data monitoring department. And then we have, very glad to have Jenna Slotin, who is the Senior Director of Policy at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. So this is very exciting to be having this amazing panel. But before I go to our panel with the first round of questions, let me come back to you, Jay, to see if you have put up the question for the audience, which is, what do you think is the most important development in the open data landscape in the last 5 years? And if we have anything to share from the audience. Over to you, Jay.
Yes, thank you, Shaida. I think the audience is a little quiet right now, so I'm hoping they'll continue to post some answers in the chat. But so far, we've seen folks talk about the importance of the open by default principle being endorsed at the UN Statistical Commission recently. And I think your presentation really shows the long way that we've come to even get to that point from 1994 to 2021. We've also seen folks talk about how the adoption of open data licenses or existing licenses like Creative Commons has been really good evolution in the recent years. And I think that's something that, as you mentioned in your presentation, is an important piece of making sure that these data can be reused by the public. And then we've also seen people talking about how synthetic data is helping community as a whole and is a big success overall. So I'm heartened by these responses, and I think I would encourage people in the chat to continue to answer as the presentation goes on. But over to you, Shaida.
Thanks, Jay. That's great. I was trying to also read the comments. So let's now go to our panelists. And the question that I have for the panel, for our panelists, and it's the same question for you all. But let me start with you, Grant, and then I move to Luis, and then Akrom, and then Jenna. Grant, starting with you, given your unique perspective and the role that you've had within the open data community, what is that one positive, if you can summarize it in one, but if you want to go to two, you can. What is that one positive open data trend that you have noticed in the last 5 years that you also think is useful for us to take note of and keep learning from? Over to you, Grant.
Thanks very much, Shaida. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great.
Very well.
And I'm delighted to be part of this panel today. So thanks again for inviting me. And yeah, I guess maybe just to start, my one positive thing that I'd like to highlight to this roundtable is that not only are more statistical producers, national statistical offices, making their data open, but they're also taking steps to ensure that their open data has an impact. And I think here it's important to refer back to Shaida's data value chain that she mentioned earlier. I represent a sort of a research network in innovations in data and statistics. And so I think from the research community, the literature suggests the way in which one can sort of take open government data and support better government services is through 3 different paths. And I think we are seeing the national statistical offices are being active in the last 5 years in providing open data that are customized to each of those 3 pathways to ensure their data has impact. So I'm just going to highlight these 3 paths, and then I'm going to mention very quickly how NSOs are supporting that. So the first path is the accountability path. Open data allows citizens to assess the performance of political leaders, which provides the incentives to these leaders to deliver effective services. An example of this path might be citizens accessing political leadership during the COVID crisis and using elections to change leaders should they be seen as falling short. NSOs understand that holding political leadership to account requires consistently good statistics. Measures of trends in inflation or income are not helpful if the quality of these measures change over time. And with new forms of big data becoming more accessible to produce statistics, NSOs need to ensure they maintain the quality of their statistical products when they incorporate these new data sources into their production process. And I think over the last 5 years, there have been countless examples of countries who've used these non-traditional data, maintained quality, and adjusted their data governance arrangements to ensure that this quality has been maintained. The second path is the client power path, where open data allows citizens or citizens groups to have direct discussions with government service providers in local settings to improve services. This path does not necessarily require engaging with political officials. An example of this path might be open data on school performance, allowing local civil groups to have evidence-based discussions directly with school boards and other leaders in the school curriculum development and delivery community. To support this client power path, NSOs are enabling citizens' engagement in government performance discussions. For example, in Ghana, the statistical service there is working through a civil society platform to provide information necessary for local groups to participate in budget and planning discussions. The third path I would call the sort of government improve thyself path, in which open data has perhaps surprisingly improved government's ability to access its own data to better tailor policies and programs, as open data broke down data silos within governments, and governments began to recognize that data collected for one purpose may prove beneficial to inform and design programs for another purpose. And through this third route, NSOs are supporting this government improve thyself path, as many are now acting as advisors on data stewardship for whole of government approaches to leverage the data assets they have on hand to improve their performance. And I think it's always important to remember that the NSOs are supporting these three pathways while acting within expected cultural and ethical norms regarding the data in which they disseminate. And I think the fundamental principles that Shaida mentioned during her presentation are a clear set of guidance on how they maintain that sort of capacity to support these performance processes while respecting ethical and integrity. So to sum up, from my perspective, over the past 5 years, we've seen open data move from the basics of making data more accessible and usable through data portals, machine readability, terms of use, many of the things that the audience has already identified, and things that are more the technical foundation that NSOs could do in isolation, to a more user engagement model that allows for the NSOs to engage and gather feedback through these three pathways to ensure NSO products and services through open government agendas shape government service delivery. Thanks.
Thanks, Grant. I really like and appreciate the three paths and also the role of NSOs, the accountability, client power, and the government improve thyself path. So that's really very well. And I agree that we see a shift from the basic open data role that many countries were looking at, which was more of a if they would go open data, to this more of how can they engage more with the users and get more value. So let me now move to our second speaker with the same question, Luis. The same question to you on given your perspective from the UN and the role that you have played in the data community. What is that one positive open data trend? And I know you're not going to stop just like Grant did and with one, but what is that one positive or two positive open data trend that you have noticed in the last 5 years? Over to you, Luis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shaida and colleagues. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be part of this conversation. Let me try to point to one thing that I think is very important. As in this timeline that you presented at the beginning, Shaida, I think 2017 is a watershed moment for us in the space of open data. Now, open data, which originally is a movement that has its origins largely as a bottom-up grassroots phenomenon, has been finally embraced by the official statistical community, and it is squarely anchored in the fundamental principles of official statistics. So following the Cape Town Global Action Plan for Sustainable Development Data that was launched in 2017 in the first World Data Forum. In that year, the Statistical Commission officially recognized the critical role of open data initiatives and the role that they play in supporting the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and encouraged different groups in the global statistical community to take into account relevant aspects of open data in their respective work programs. So the following year, in 2018, for the first time in the history of Statistical Commission, open data was part of the agenda of the discussions, and the Commission highlighted the role that national statistical offices have to play in promoting data openness, not only for data under the control of national statistical offices, but also for data owned by the private sector, by other government agencies in academia and the wider national statistical system. So the Commission as well in this moment recognized that we needed a cultural shift. We needed also develop new skills, develop new governance frameworks, and so on, develop capacities for national statistical offices to be able to implement open data. And so it created a subgroup under the fundamental principles of official statistics to work on these issues, to develop further the principles, to provide guidance and support the implementation of open data at the country level. And that led in 2019 to the creation of an open data working group. And this year, this has also been taken, this topic on open data, by the working group on data stewardship. So in this very short period of 5 years, open data reached the highest level of discussion in the global statistical community. And some accomplishments that we have seen over the last 5 years include the review of the principles for open data and legal frameworks for open data, clarifying for national statistical offices technical aspects, providing guidance on tools on how to implement open data practices, including guidance on interoperability, guidance on how to open data at the local level. And the community also, the global statistical community also made tremendous progress now, as Eric mentioned in the chat, this development of an open by default model for official statistics, the identification of best practices for data licensing and for the harmonization of these open data principles with national statistical legal frameworks. So all this is tremendous progress. And I know we will have a chance to talk about the challenges that remain, but this is something that I wanted to stress at the outset. Yeah, thank you so much, Shaida.
Thanks a lot, Luis. I think that's really important to mention that in sort of in the trend in the last few years that has worked, and that is to really give open data legitimacy within the framework for statistical system, for national statistical processes. And you're right, that is really tremendously important. And we've seen, as you said, many of the technical tools. We've seen also open data is now a chapter in the national strategies for statistics with Paris 21 supports. So it's really been mainstream, if you will, in the structure and in the standards of official statistics. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And looking back, it's been a lot of work by many of you and many of us, of course. So also we want to take a moment and acknowledge the community that has pushed this forward. It was not an easy task. Anyway, so now come to same question to you, Akrom. You are in a very special position from your National Statistical Office and country perspective. So tell us within the role that you're playing in the open data community, what is that one positive open data trend that you have noticed at the international level or at the national level in Uzbekistan? Over to you, Akrom.
Thank you, Shaida. Thank you, dear colleagues, dear participants. From my point of view, I can say the best positive trend is the good community of open data. So I try to explain why. I cannot tell about 5 years, unfortunately, because I began work with open data and developing the open data in my country only the last 3 years. But I'm not working on the developing an open data on statistical office. Our statistical office is responsible for the whole open data portal of our country and development of all governmental bodies open data in our country. It's some kind of unique maybe in the world. Of course, why the community? Initially, 3 years ago, I and my team began from the zero. Our knowledge about open data, about openness, etc., was close to zero, close to nothing. And at the same time, in the rankings and some kind of indices on open data, our country was in very, very low ranks, unfortunately. Most important for us was the assistance of our partners. For example, international organizations, Open Data Watch, OSCE, World Bank, and they give us the opportunity to learn a lot in a very short time. Some also the countries like Ukraine, others also give us a lot of help in the beginning. So at that time, during these 3 years, we improved totally our legislation because a lot of legislation, a lot of data was closed by the legislation. We removed all these obstacles and give the opportunity a lot of data to put the data to all of our governmental bodies. We have launched a new portal. Now it's a very up-to-date portal, and we can also up-to-date it later. We have taught many employees of governmental bodies how to work with open data, what to do. And in teaching this also the employees, a lot of our partners have helped us, of course. So now we're working closely with data users to show them, because we have a lot of data in our new portal, and now the users should know what to do with this massive of data. Okay, still a lot of to do, but in from my point of view, is the best community open data, because every partner is close and open to you to help you to all the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akrom. I really appreciate that, and that you have used the power of the community. And I mean, congratulations also to you. There've been a lot of support from the international organizations and other groups, but some countries like yourself have been so well in position to be able to utilize that and also work around the legal side of the open data. And we have seen you make huge progress. So also congratulations from us to you for making that happen. So Jenna, now I come to you with the same question, and you actually have a very important perspective as well. And we want to hear what is that one positive open data trend that you have noticed in the last 5 years. Over to you, Jenna.
Thanks so much, Shaida, and thanks for having me here today. It's such a pleasure to be on the panel with this great group and with you, Shaida. The trend that I'm going to point to is a trend that is more related to, I think, the enabling environment for open data, rather than a trend in open data particularly. And that is from where I sit in the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. That is, in the last 5 years or so, we've seen a real emergence of discussion and defining the concept of data stewardship broadly across government and in the private sector, but also in particular and importantly, as many people have already pointed to, in the context of official statistics, the global statistical community, and amongst NSOs. And I think that trend to think about data stewardship and what it means and what the implications are for NSOs is directly relevant for open data. What's interesting too, in terms of the timeline that Luis touched on, that you touched on, Shaida, is that the same UN Statistical Commission, where open by default was endorsed in 2021, the Data Stewardship Working Group of the UN Statistical Commission was also formed. So these things were coming together at the same time. So why is data stewardship, I think, really important? Well, I'd like to draw on some of the great work done by that working group to kind of reflect on this, particularly by you, Shaida, and your team at Open Data Watch and others. So in a recent survey of that working group and of NSOs that you all undertook, you identified 4 features of data stewardship that I think encompass the ideas advanced by the open data community, but they also go beyond to address some new and emerging challenges for open data and for the statistical community more generally. They encompass questions of, first, governing the data ecosystem to improve the use and reuse of data for the public good. So that encompasses many of the concepts, I think, that were very much developed and recognized over the timeline that you outlined, around quality, around reliability, around access, usability, interoperability, machine readability, open licenses, et cetera. So we're encompassing all of these ideas within the broader concept of data stewardship. Data stewardship also speaks to the ethical and responsible creation, collection, and management and use of data. That's the second feature. The third feature is around the role of NSOs in coordination and cooperation between data providers and users. And Grant focused on this user-focused engagement piece, but there's also the piece about sharing and facilitating the reuse of data across government that others have touched on. And the last is around ensuring data protection, standardization, and quality to build and maintain trust. One of the things that I really want to emphasize is this trust piece, because I think the concept of data stewardship helps us go even further in understanding what it means to establish trust and how open data is a part of that, but it's now a kind of a broader discussion. And as I was thinking about this to prepare for this panel, I reread the introduction, the State of Open Data book. What I thought was interesting was that at the time, so in 2019, the introduction reflected that over the last decades, the debates about the role of data in society have moved to center stage, but arguments for openness now, excuse me, sorry about that. That arguments for openness now have to share the spotlight with the newer excitement over the economic potential of big data and machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the growing fears about the negative impacts of all of this. And the introduction characterized open data as having to share the spotlight with this excitement around AI and new data sources, and sort of said it's no longer possible to think of open data as an unalloyed public good, but rather to think about power, politics, and the question of who gains or loses from unfolding regimes of data, of who gains or loses from these unfolding regimes of data access. And I think that the concept and the evolution of our thinking of data stewardship and the role of the NSO as a data steward to establish trust through openness, through data reliability, through data quality, but also in thinking about engagement with users, engagement with affected communities. What are the impacts on equity from the collection and use and governance of data really matter for that enabling environment of trust? And so I think the concept of open data helps us to move beyond this notion of sharing the spotlight between, on the one hand, excitement about the possibilities of open data, and on the other hand, fears and concerns about privacy and protections, but rather to a world where we are now, where we think about the role of stewards to establish an environment that allows us to govern so that we can really realize and unlock the value of data through openness and through all of the great work of the open data community, but also be thinking about some of those broader questions that allow us to establish an environment of trust. And a more complex and nuanced approach to data governance. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Shaida, and thanks for bringing up the data stewardship so well, and how really it makes sense for open data to be looked at and actually studied further, and for research and best practices within the data stewardship, with the aims that you mentioned on accessibility and quality, ethical use of data, and sort of promoting the role of NSOs and kind of getting them involved in building trust and building value for data. Really appreciate that. It's a great point, and very important points. We'll have to listen to your, and you have transcript written down your speech. We need the writing to sort of really go over that, because it's a very important point that you're raising. So thank you for the first round of questions. I see, as Jay, I see that our audience is not very active, but do you want to tell us a little bit about your question too, and anything else that you're hearing from the audience, whether from the YouTube channel or any other groups that are watching this event?
Sure. Thank you so much, Shaida. And I think the question for everyone's context is really, I think, jumps off what Jenna was talking about really well, is looking to the future. And I think a lot of our panelists are really excited to think about the challenges and opportunities to come. So the question we pose to the audience is, in their opinion, what is the next frontier of open data? And so far, we've seen conversations about using open data from the private sector and how we can leverage that within the official statistics community to think about how we can tackle key challenges related to climate change, for example. And I think that's a really exciting and interesting area to explore and discuss. And I think the other one that really touches on this idea of trust is open access to microdata while protecting individual confidentiality and privacy. And so that thinking through sort of how do we make sure that we have access to all of this information while still ensuring that there's trust and that citizens feel like they have their privacy and confidentiality is protected. So far, those are the two main points. I encourage the audience to continue to either ask questions or respond to this question. But over to you, Shaida, for the next round. And I'm excited to hear what the panelists say.
Thank you. Thanks, Jay. And thanks for those of you who have been giving us some responses to this important question on the next frontier of open data. So we now go to the round two of discussions with our panel. And the question that I have for our panelists, going with the same order, starting with you, Grant, is looking to the future, what is that one risk that the open data community should be mindful of moving forward? It could be a risk of, that you have in mind of, explaining that risk, but also, how we can overcome that risk. Over to you, Grant.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in my initial set of interventions, I talked about how National Statistical Office had moved past sort of the improvements of data portals, terms of use, to being more engaged with users as a way of kind of ensuring that their data was customized to help support government service delivery. And I think one of the risks is backsliding and retreating from those processes and moving back to just providing this sort of data portal approach to supporting service delivery. And I'll finish by why I think that's a big risk. But I think the reason that is a risk is that supporting these three pathways to better governance service for NSOs is very labor intensive. It takes a lot of effort to get out there, engage with actors in these processes. And I feel getting out there, as like touching upon what Jenna just said, I think is an important element of building and maintaining trust with user communities. People who are engaged with their users tend to be more trusted by their users. And I think we've seen the pandemic provide lots of incentives for NSOs to engage with users, to adjust their data to support service deliveries in government. And there's been many, many documented cases from some of the World Data Forum webinars. Ethiopia, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Canada, UZSTAT have all featured how they've done that. But I think as these sort of the pressures of addressing and understanding the pandemic recede, there's a question of whether these labor-intensive processes will continue. And in some cases, these processes were a little bit like a shotgun marriage. It took a lot of years and probably a pandemic to get health departments and many government agencies to share data with statistical agencies. And I think the risks that these processes break down is probably heightened by the potential for funding to be cut to NSOs as government spending priorities shift to address things like rising borrowing costs related to pandemic spending, addressing other social issues that are dealing with rising inflation, et cetera. So it would be unfortunate for NSOs to sort of perceive these user engagement processes as sort of non-core activities and scale them back if these budget constraints do indeed appear. And I feel that the big issue associated with the big risk of falling back to a sort of a basic open data portal model risks at this stage reinforcing unequal power amongst the groups in society from being able to take advantage of open data and transform it into impact. So we've noticed in many circumstances, and one I'll choose is not from the NSO community, but it's from the city of Los Angeles community, is they have a whole engagement strategy called Empower LA that helps train community groups on how to combine their community data with city data and transform these data into evidence to help them advocate for change at the city council level. And my worry is that if these types of programs face scaling back, the groups endowed with already high levels of technical abilities will have more say on how government delivers services than those that need this kind of support. Thanks.
So, Grant, sorry, tell us a little bit more of how would you manage that risk, the backsliding risk? Is it, more financing, more sort of here to stay agreements on data sharing, more hardcore memorandum of understanding? What do you think? How do we manage that risk so that we don't end up with just a few websites, as you said, with unequal access?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing one needs to do is ensure that NSOs see this type of user engagement as a core deliverable. It's core and central to the way in which they have to operate now, that it wasn't just a temporary measure associated with addressing the pandemic, but some of these engagement models have to be enforced and nurtured. And so I feel when they think about prioritizing their spending, I think it's very, very important for them to maintain these pathways. And not just fall back. I do feel that there is I think that to the degree to which, this entire community can ensure that there are sort of governance arrangements or memoranda of understanding or championing for NSOs to maintain this kind of outward point of view, this user-centric model. I think that's going to be really important. So I don't think there's a single magic bullet to sort of solve this problem. I think it requires users to kind of insist on getting these kinds of services. And I think it's important for the statistical offices to acknowledge that this is now indeed part of their core mandate and not just something that's a nice to have. Thanks.
Thank you. That's terrific, and that's so important. And this is one of the things maybe we have to do to revisit the guidelines for national statistical development planning and other tools of bringing this important engagement features more to the front in the planning and allocation of budgets. Thanks, that's really important. So moving to you, Luis, same question as we just had with Grant on looking to the future. What is that one risk that the open data community should be mindful of moving forward? Luis?
Yeah, thank you, Shaida, and I hope I can add to the great comments from Grant and the rest of the panelists. So I think the risk I see for the open data movement in general is to become a victim of its own success. So we've seen that the digital revolution, citizen movements for transparency and so on have really created a boom in the universe of data that is openly available outside. So NSOs have embraced open data portals as key instruments for data dissemination, as you have well documented in the work of Open Data Watch, and all kinds of data producers are now able to put out their data independently from each other, and it is often now left to the consumers, to the data users, to understand how different data sets relate to each other and make connections when appropriate. So we may end up we are ending up in some cases in a sort of data wilderness where the web of data that is available contains a lot of valuable information, but there is not guarantee that it is orderly or readily understandable. There is no guarantee that all communities have equitable access, as Grant was saying, or that every different types of communities can derive useful insight from them. There is risk that some of this openness is mostly leveraged by small group interests rather than used for broad social good. So I think the risk is in the inability to bring order, to bring understanding to this expanding universe of open data, and that then has repercussions on issues of trust and can be detrimental for this infodemic that we are living through of too much false, misleading information. So we need to tackle that head on. No? So we need not to stop in sharing data and opening data, but focus on the creation of digital public goods. So open data as a public good for public for the benefit of everyone, and that includes not only open data, that includes also open software, open standards, open algorithms, collaboration in how data is used, and also I think very important for ensuring trust is not only collaboration in the use of data, but also in the co-creation of data. So the best way to foster trust is to build things together. And I think that is something that we need the framework for. New governance, data management frameworks that allow different stakeholder groups, different institutions to collaborate in building digital products together. And that for that, the enabling environment is having open software, open standards, open algorithms beyond just open data. Sorry. So yeah, I would stop there. I hope this makes sense.
Absolutely, Luis. I think that's very, very important point. And and as we said, and also Akrom was saying, and what we have learned from the past is that this community of open data was the one that the enabler and made what we see right now happen. And for going forward, what I hear from you is we need to take a new, fresh look at that community, and maybe that community needs to be expanded to bring in open access to software, bring in data users, and bring. Maybe we need a new international open data conference, new IODC. of bringing and doing this, bringing everyone together, and maybe the World Data Forum. So no, that's a very important risk, and also very tough strategically how to manage that, address it, because it's an issue for the producers, but it's also an issue for the governors of data and also for the users of data. Very important point. Akrom, turning to you with the same question as we just heard from Grant and Luis on, telling us what is that one risk that the open data community should be mindful of moving forward. Akrom?
Thank you, Shaida. You already answered your own question about the community. That's why I will not stop on it. Also, we need, in that case that you mentioned earlier, about the community. Also, my previous partners, previous colleagues talk theoretical, of course, risks, but I want to talk about my own 3 directions in our country, that we are trying to do. And for example, if we are moving right in the 3 directions, so we can also achieve the results and share the results and our success stories about this in the future. But if we are in a wrong way, we can at the same time also share the mistakes and help other partners not to do this anymore. What these 3 kind of directions? First of all, we try to use artificial technologies and combine it with the open data and big data. So now we run and develop the platform in our open data portal, which will be responsible to work with very big, massive data and try to help and make more useful our open data and big data in our country. And it's only the beginning. I cannot say about the results. We will share it maybe in several years later. Another direction, we are closely work with the Against Corruption Agency and try to develop and work more on open data, which helps to reduce the corruption in our country. This is very important direction for us and for our country. The third one, in our opinion, open data can do a wider things, not only as an open data, but closely collaborate with the openness of all governmental bodies, makes them all not only putting the data, but be more open for all the users in our country. At the same time, we can see the power of openness. This is the 3 directions that I was told that I want to tell all the participants. And after several times, we can share about the results, our mistakes. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Akrom. Those are amazing, amazing new frontiers that we will definitely will be learning and being in contact with you, particularly using the open data, the power of open data to bring in new data sources like the big data, the managing, the really wicked issues in countries like corruption, and of course the power of open data for improving collaboration within government is really music to our ear for those who are in the open data space. So thank you for that. And those are definitely benefits of open data that we have to try to realize in other countries. Jenna, we're coming to you with that frontier question, and really eager to hear your perspective on what do you think is that one, risk or one element of the frontier that you think, or moving forward, that we have to keep in mind. Over to you, Jenna.
Thanks, Shaida. Well, at the risk of oversimplification, I think the greatest risk is a reverse of all the positive trends that we've discussed on the call. In other words, the flip side of the coin to everything we talked about in the first half of the webinar. And so, you know, how do we prevent that from happening, right? So what we've really been emphasizing is the trend toward user engagement, the trend toward collaboration across stakeholders, the trend toward adopting and implementing the principles of the open data community in ways that sort of build trust and foster, you know, a more sort of nuanced and thoughtful governance. And I think that, you know, the risk then is a retreat into everyone's like old corners, right? Grant spoke about a backslide in terms of moving back away from users because it's resource intensive, because it's hard, et cetera. A kind of like retreat in terms of like not working across government anymore, not working with other stakeholders. I noticed in the chat, we had a suggestion that a new frontier is engagement with the private sector. But of course, there the big risks are that the speed of technological change and the speed of evolution in the private sector with new technologies create so much fear, right, that we retreat from that and don't sort of experiment. And so I'll posit that in fact, and to be just a little bit provocative, maybe we shouldn't be talking about the open data community anymore as a set community, because I think what we're talking about is the ways in which the open data community has been kind of the front edge of this spear to kind of motivate and drive really serious and important innovation in the world of official statistics, in the world of sort of data science and beyond. And that we're in this kind of new world where we can no longer sort of be speaking from silos or particular groups or communities, and we need to be thinking about a much more kind of complex, I mean, back to the word ecosystem or whatever you want to call it, a way of engaging stakeholders, a way of building partnerships, a way of being sort of flexible and malleable, but with a kind of very strong sort of normative and principles-based framework, much of which already exists because it's been developed by the official statistics communities and the research and science community and others, right? And so I think that what we want to see is a kind of continued movement along this great track to be embracing this complexity, and that perhaps it's not helpful any longer, whatever the labels are, to be thinking about those kind of, you know, kind of separate communities. A final thought on this point that I'm making is I remember in 2015 when we were with many of you in the webinar establishing the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And we talked about how we were bringing together actors across geographies. We talked about bringing actors together across sectors, so agriculture, health, et cetera, public, private, but we also talked about how we were bringing together actors across data communities, open data, geospatial, big data, official statistics. And I'd posit that that's no longer a helpful frame for this conversation, and that we've found ourselves, and I think the data stewardship frame is a really helpful way to think about that, is what does it mean to steward all of this data and statistics in a way that really helps us achieve the outcomes in terms of sustainable development, in terms of social good, in terms of service delivery, et cetera, that we're working towards. Thanks.
Thanks, Shaida. That's really, really important. And thanks for looping it back and to the partnership and how we can use the power of this breaking silos between different communities to manage this risk of retreating back to our corners after all this progress and hard work that we have done. So those are tremendously important. So at this point of our roundtable, I was hoping to go back to Jay and to see whether we have had any interventions or any issues or questions that our audience have raised that the panelists could address. If not, you know, we will probably have received a couple of questions also before the meeting from Muchiri and other colleagues that we would we would like to ask maybe 1 or 2 more rounds of questions from our panelists. But over to you, Jay. Is there anything that is standing out that we need to address?
I think so far, there are no questions in the chat just yet, but hopefully people will start dropping in their questions. We've opened it up. So I think we can go with the question that we had already talked about earlier to get the conversation going. And I encourage the audience to continue to ask questions of our panelists, thinking through if they agree, disagree with some of the risks and trends identified, thinking through what the next steps could be for the open data community.
Thanks, Jay. So I have maybe 3 questions that I want to bring out, and then I turn to the panel to see whether they want to answer any of them, any of those questions, or also if they want to make any sort of final remarks in this roundtable as we move our work forward to update and sort of look at what issues we need to highlight for the next chapter, next round of the open data chapter for official statistics. One question that I had, which we heard earlier from Muchiri, is that, and we also heard from the other roundtables on different topics of open data, is the question of, is there any wisdom that you can offer in how can we improve financing for open data, and also financing for any of the elements of the enabling environment, or users engagement or other elements? What can we do to actually make a case? Is there any wisdom that you could offer on the financing side? The other question that I have, if anyone wants to answer, is that, and we received that through some social media, is that how do we balance and how do we work on improving data coverage and data quality, while at the same time we are pursuing open data and user engagement and whatnot? Is how can we not lose sight in some of the risks that we have even talked about on data quality? And the third question, if anybody wants to answer, is some sectors, for example, the gender data, are for some peculiar reason, and we're trying to find out more, as part of the research work that we're doing with our partners, ODW, some sectors such as gender data are behind other sectors. In fact, social statistics in some ways are behind other thematic areas in terms of data availability and data openness. Is there any wisdom or any ideas or any thoughts you could offer on that one? So are those 3 questions, one on quality, one on financing, one on gender data openness. If any of you want to answer any of them, please just raise your hand, and I hope each one of you at least answers one of them. Who wants to go first?
Can I?
Yes, Akrom, please.
Shaida, I have just only some ideas now, the global ideas, not about only my country. Unfortunately, the openness, the future, and most of your questions depends on the country. I mean, the people, politics, and the people who run the country. If they give the opportunity, because in a lot of countries, maybe in all of our countries, there is a people who want for the openness, open the data, open the governmental bodies and work openly. But it depends on if they are allowed or not allowed. So the community should work more and try to explain, because in some countries, in my opinion, it's difficult to the people who tries and wants to tell all their intentions to the big bosses. And if the community worked on that more actively, explain to that country, even if you see on your coding or ranks, there's a lot of misunderstanding, not misunderstanding, You can see some improvements in one country, and there is no, maybe even not so good result in others. Thank you.
Thank you, Akrom. Jenna, you want to go next?
Yeah, I thought I'd try to take a run at the question about ensuring data remains comprehensive and of high quality, while kind of managing all the other things we've talked about, like user engagement and sort of collaboration, et cetera. And I think that really it's seeing those as not mutually exclusive, but actually mutually reinforcing that really matters. So in recent work that our team has done with a whole diverse set of hundreds of partners in a year-long consultation called the Data Values Project, it's become very clear through concrete examples that engaging with users and engaging with affected communities through new approaches like citizen-generated data, like mechanisms for validating and verifying analysis and interpretation, or the design of questionnaires, et cetera, with representatives of different expert groups and different community groups, actually improves the comprehensiveness and the quality of the data. So I want to stop and say that is not to the exclusion of statistical rigor or standards, right? So those things are incredibly important as a foundation. But in cases like Kenya, where the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics has actually developed and adopted a quality assurance framework and guideline for civil society, because they're embracing citizen-generated data as a method to capture information that they can't get more granularity, more color from communities, to sort of understand, to better understand, to get a more comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon they're measuring, is one indicator. In Colombia, where DANE, the National Statistical Office, has adopted a group they call the Interdisciplinary and Intersectional group, which is made up of experts and community representatives who look at their approaches to ensure that they're being as inclusive and getting, they're working towards more equitable outcomes in the way that they design and collect data and produce statistics and review and validate. So there are lots of interesting mechanisms that are being tried and adopted to get higher quality, more comprehensive, more granular data, while not sacrificing statistical standards, and actually building that base of trust, because the approaches are fundamentally about engagement, and they're fundamentally about the kind of collaboration and partnership that we're talking about.
Thank you. And is this, do you think is manageable for NSOs to move into this new model of user-centric engagement? Do they have the resources? Do they have the right skills? Do they have the right processes to be able to not get lost in that engagement?
That's a great question, Shaida. And of course, many don't today. It's really daunting. It increases considerably the demands on NSOs and other actors. But I think what's clear is that they recognize that in some cases, the outcomes are sort of better measurement. And so it's worth the investment and working towards finding the funding, setting aside the funding, building the skills. In other cases, it may be cost saving, because the different approaches may allow for new methods that are less resource intensive than a kind of enumerator-based model of conducting surveys periodically, but not always. And I think thirdly, the reason why I gave the example of Kenya and Colombia, but there are also examples from places like Zanzibar and elsewhere, is to show that in many lower resource settings or lower capacity settings, there's a recognition that this can be done and it should be tried. And so while indeed there's a lot of work to do to support those actors who want to embark upon this path and test new methods and see what's going to work in their context, there's a lot of opportunity to provide that support, and we should be realistic about the limitations. It's nonetheless possible.
Thanks, Jenna. I fully agree with you. That's really great comments. So let's go to you, Grant, and answer as many questions you want, or identify which one.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I was going to take a stab at answering the question that came in from the chat, which came in from Lofty Ben Maui, which I guess roughly translates into, how can we ensure that the reliability and quality of open data is sort of limited by manipulation by sort of decision makers, politicians, which could be an issue in particular in developing countries. And I think it's a really good question, and it's one that requires a bit of balancing. So I think on the one hand, I think to ensure that there's quality and that there isn't this type of political interference, it is central to the legitimacy of the statistical office's function. So if we don't have a legitimate statistical office, one that's data isn't trusted, then it really can't function in its role in government. And to me, I think this is where important governance mechanisms can be helpful. And I think a lot of the panel have already talked about steps taken to ensure that there's good mechanisms that align how things are organized to be consistent with these fundamental principles that have been discussed. But I think equally important and sometimes missing is an enforcement mechanism for those types of laws. So there also needs to be something within the context of machinery of government that allows for the assessment that these laws are actually being followed by the executive branch. And so you need both a set of laws and a mechanism to ensure those laws are being followed. The tricky balancing act, I think, on this issue is how do you ensure that type of independence in a statistical office's statistical products and offerings, while maintaining a dialogue that allows for the data products to evolve with the requirements of policymakers. And I think this is the tricky balancing act. I think in the past, one has seen statistical offices, I guess, implement independence through isolation. And I don't know if that's been a particularly good way of ensuring that they are engaged in understanding how the data required by society and policymakers vary. So this notion of sort of being relevant and legitimate is in some ways is a bit of a tricky trade-off. And I think that one really needs to look at each country's circumstances to understand how to get that balance right. Thanks.
Thanks, Gran, and thanks for answering that question. It's always good to have a Canadian on the panel who speaks both French and English. So thank you very much. Actually, in fact, we have two of them, Jenna. Sorry. Luis, over to you. Tell us which question you're answering, please.
So I would like to sort of delve into this issue of trust, but I think it has also implications to the question on being able to cover data for specific groups that are misrepresented, like gender data and others. So I think as Grant was just saying, independence is not the same as isolation, and as Jenna was emphasizing, to be able to develop trust in the data, we need to engage with the users and create value to the users and co-create value with the users. So I think that is the step that we need to be focusing very intently in the next few years on. How do we jointly create value with our users? And that has hopefully positive feedback into the availability of resources for creating data and for sustaining the production of open data as a public good. So this idea of creating value out of the existing data, out of open data in the wilderness of multiple data sources, multiple users, multiple stakeholder groups. It's like a Sisyphean kind of a task where we need to continually revisit what are the needs of the users, what are the new context, new users' needs, so that we continue adapting our our data products are in a way that they offer value. So that also makes me think of, for instance, the creation of data on specific topics like gender data. We need to involve those groups. No, it's not only creating data that we believe is relevant. Is data that say indigenous populations or groups with disabilities or any other kind of group, they engaged with us in co-creating the data. Yeah, and I think that could lead to a lot of positive dynamics, creating more trust, more value, and bringing back resources to continue the development of statistical systems in the countries. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Luis. So we're coming to close to the end of our roundtable, and I wanted to sort of go around to our four panelists and give you all just sort of a flash opportunity for a flash mention of something that you think as we go forward with the work that we're doing with IDRC and D4DNet. And the building these communities of open data and the refreshing of the open data, state of open data. If you were to sort of advise us on one or two things that we need to focus on, just give us a sort of a flash mention of some of the things you've mentioned, but that needs to be really on our radar going forward for this work and for the refreshing of the state of open data. What would that be? Be just anything that comes to your head, that you don't have to really work harder on that one. It's been a long session. So Grant, starting with you, what is that one thing that you think should be in the outline of the open data refresh?
I think maybe just highlighting more of these pathways to improving government services. I think the data value chain that you've highlighted earlier is pretty well entrenched in the national statistics community now. And I think thinking through that process and how open data can sort of support that entire process is something that I would highlight more in this chapter. Thank you.
Definitely, very good. Pathways to improving government services and going beyond what we've been so far talking about. Luis, what would be that one thing that you want to see in the outline of the refresh?
I would like to see more work on building common but lightweight governance and data management frameworks that allow different communities to engage with each other, to organize the information that they share to each other. So these governance frameworks, data management frameworks can leverage new technologies, new tools. What is very important, I think, in my mind, is that these frameworks need to be really lightweight, really easy to use. Because if we go back to very strong, rigid legal framework rules, that could be counterproductive. So, thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Akrom? What would be that one thing that you want to see from what we discussed and what you think it would be in the refresh of the state of open data with focus?
Thank you, Shaida. I can see the good idea from one of our participants. I can support it, Mr. Eric Swanson. I hope that's yes, Swanson. Open access to microdata while protecting individual confidentiality. So we should work more on this, but of course, take into account the individual confidentiality. Thank you.
Thank you, Akrom. I think that's, you put your finger on a hugely important, but extremely tough area. So, and often things which are really hard are also very important. So thank you for that. And Jenna, what would be that one thing you want to see in our outline for refresh of open data?
I have to confess that Luis stole my thunder, and I, have been thinking, can I try to think of something different to say? But you know what? I'm not going to. I'm just going to endorse Luis's point about governance frameworks that are lightweight and flexible, and that really provide that framework for all of this connective tissue we've been discussing on this call to form and be sustained. Thanks.
Thanks, Shaida. I love that. Two of you on the governance framework, lightweight and flexible. Really beautiful. Well, I just wanted to thank you all for really important discussion. We've heard amazing things from you, and thank God we have recording of this session so that we can go back and listen to some of your amazing points that you have raised. We hear amazing things that's been already done, but how we can sustain it and going forward as how can we use the power of what we have done, but also with the risk and what we need to manage. At the center of it comes users, which is really beautiful, of user-centric model, but also a lot of expertise that you have offered at the country level, at the international level, as how to manage, what are the risks and how to manage it. So I wanted to thank you all and say we have a lot of material from you. And even if we started the refresh tomorrow, I think we have a lot of work, but we are going to have other roundtables. And I'm gonna turn to my colleague Muchiri to sort of close this and sort of see whether there are any instructions for us for taking this work forward. But a big thank you from me to you, Jenna, Grant, Akrom, Luis. Special thanks to my colleague Jay for helping us organize this, and of course to Muchiri and colleagues Anna and colleagues for helping us to put this together. Thank you, and over to you, Muchiri.
Thank you, Shaida. This was a particularly engaging session. I've really learned a lot, and I'm going away with some earworms, continuously playing in my ear, and Jenna's challenged to move away from that open data community paradigm. I'm challenged. So I'm looking forward to listening to all of this again and promoting this. But most importantly, that the chapter that we shall that will be published, that will come out of this work, will be a really useful tool in our advocacy to help improve open data in the national statistics context and data for development more broadly. So thank you very much, Shaida, and the entire panel. It was such a delight. Your perspectives are quite insightful. So this session is available on the d4d.net YouTube channel. So please do go ahead, share it with your networks and anyone you feel should have been here or could have been here and couldn't make it for one reason or another. And if they see this, that it might inspire them as well and give them ideas, and they can jump into the chat function, the comment function on the YouTube channel and add their insights, and we would all be delighted to see that. To everyone else, thank you for joining us on this roundtable on the state of open data for national statistics. We look forward to seeing you again in 29 minutes. That's at 1500 GMT for our last roundtable in this 5-part series, which will be on the state of open data for anti-corruption. This 5-part series was our first set of roundtable discussions. As Shaida has mentioned, we will be having more. We will keep you updated on those. If you had registered for this session, means your email address is available, and we'll be happy to let you know when the next roundtables are kicking off. With that, I bid you farewell. Enjoy the rest of your day, and have a fantastic weekend. Or see you in 30 minutes. Bye-bye.